My friends, in the heart of West Africa, there's a war that most of the world has completely forgotten about, and it is something that is reaching a breaking point. Mali, which, yes, was always a kind of fragile democracy, now ruled by a military junta, is fighting for its very survival. For over a decade, jihadist insurgents that have been linked to Al Qaeda and the Islamic State have been carving out vast territories across the Sahel, turning Mali, as well as Burkina Faso and Niger, into the deadliest terrorism hotspot on Earth. And as for how fast all this went down, in the span of just 3 years, a belt of military juntas would seize power and form between three separate countries, expelling French forces, kicking out American drone bases, dismantling UN missions, and tearing up decades of Western influence in the region. And in their place, they would replace it with Moscow. Well, my friends, before we do get back into today's episode, I would like to thank today's sponsor, Fabletics. Which, yes, if you've noticed over the course of this so far that I'm not wearing my merchandise, that is because I am, in fact, well, yeah, this episode is sponsored by Fabletics in the first place, but also because I am actually replacing large swaths of my wardrobe with actual nicer things. Why would I do that? Because I'm told I look out of place next to my wife. Yes, for those of you that know or have seen her, she is hot. She's also very spicy. Anyway, Fabletics, yes. All right. This stuff is actually awesome for me. And I'm not saying that just for the purpose of this being an ad. I do actually mean this is awesome for me because, one, I'm in the process of trying to lose some weight and get back in shape in the first place, which all of their athletic, just super comfortable, versatile, fitting stuff that is super stretchy, breathable, and yet somehow is able to wick water at the same time is just, it's so high quality and nice. Anyway, very obviously, replacing your entire wardrobe is not something that someone can do overnight, which is one of the reasons why I really like their VIP membership. Because when you go and sign up to be a VIP, you get several kind of perks in the first place. One, as an intro offer, you get 70 to 80% off the entire site, so that's great. But then on top of that, daily, you get up to 50% off. Beyond that, even if you're not going to actually go and buy anything, every single month you get a credit on your account, which allows you to go and then buy either a two-piece outfit, like a complete set of an outfit, or to get one item that is valued up to $100. It is genuinely something that just as a gradual process, as I'm becoming more and more of an adult, which is a weird thing for me to, I guess, say here when I'm now 31, is this is a really good thing. It's a thing that is a great thing for me, for my family, for growing as a person and looking great while doing so. Gabby, thank you for saying I look okay. I'm trying to be better than okay. I don't need luck. I have Fabletics. Anyway, as I said, go and click my link down in the description. And when you sign up to be a new VIP, you can get 70 to 80% off the entire site. It is absolutely worth it. I really do recommend this stuff. And this has been super useful in Croatia, which I'm going to be posting a bunch of videos of here and pictures of soon. Thank you, Fabletics, for sponsoring me. And now back to the show. Russian African Corps operatives, the rebranded face of Wagner, now train, fight, and embed themselves with Sahelian armies, while the Kremlin will go and extract gold, uranium, and strategic leverage on Europe's southern flank. These three juntas that we're talking about here would go and form their own bloc, the Alliance of Sahel States, turning their backs on ECOWAS, the regional body that is backed by the West, and they would pivot to Russia. They would not only pivot to Russia, they would also court Iran, open doors to Turkey, and watch as China would quietly expand their own footprint in their backyard. The post colonial order in West Africa was something that was rapidly being dismantled in very real time, as these new military leaders promised very great things in their bid for total independence, as well as total power, which is something that is a little bit more complicated of a story here. But the juntas that promised security, and this was again everything that was focused on from the very beginning, have largely failed to deliver that promise, as the fighting has managed to displace millions of people now, and insurgents have opened a new front, which may be their most devastating one yet. Janim, the Al Qaeda aligned coalition, would go and launch a fuel blockade strangling the country of Mali in recent months. Tankers are being ambushed and torched on the highways from Senegal and Ivory Coast. Bamako, the capital, is running dry of any kind of fuel and resources. Gas stations are being shuttered, schools are being closed, electricity is being rationed, and this is not a good situation. Mali, a landlocked nation of 22 million people, is being choked off from the outside world. And that is not the only thing that is happening. Because at the same time, rebel groups and Islamic insurgents are gaining further ground in actual territory, the exact opposite of what was supposed to happen when the Malian government would kick out the French in favor of the Russians. It It hasn't exactly worked very well. In mid May of 2026, Mali's ruling junta and its Russian backers would go and launch airstrikes on Kidal, the northern city that had been controlled since late April by the Tuareg dominated Azawad Liberation Front, known by its more common French acronym, the FLA. Now, this attack, the whole reason that all this happened in May in the first place was that it was a response to the government losing control of the city after a joint force of fighters from the FLA and Jamaat al-Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslim, or JNIM, the JNIM, that's the acronym, which I'm going to go off of for the rest of this episode. That is something that would drive out the Malian army and the Russian African Corps, which had held the city since 2023. And that is a really big deal. I mean, to understand just how big of a blow we're talking about here, just how big of a blow this was, Kidal is the heart of the Tuareg homeland, which spans parts of the Sahara Desert and the Sahel and includes sections of a variety of different countries: Algeria, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, etc. And while previous Tuareg groups would go and collaborate with terror groups, this operation to drive the military out of Kidal was something that was the first time that the FLA and Janim had worked together against the government rather than just a simple coordination. And so now Janim controls more territory than ever before. And as a result, they've launched a masterstroke piece against the government, a fuel blockade, something that is choking Mali from the very inside. Tankers are burning on the roads from Senegal and the Ivory Coast. Bamako, the capital, is running on empty reserves at this point, and the junta's grip on power appears to be slipping. Which then, here, I guess, brings us to the question that we always ask here on the history of everything. How exactly did we get here? Is this the beginning of the end for Mali's Russian-backed junta? Can the Sahel states actually survive without Western support? What happens when an entire region manages to collapse into the hands of jihadists? What does it mean for Europe, which is already on its own facing a migration crisis from its Mediterranean shores? What does it mean for the United States, which had lost a counterterrorism foothold in the region? And what does it mean for the global contest between the West, Russia, and China over the future of Africa? There is a lot of questions that we can ask here. And today, my friends, that is what we're going to try and answer. We're going to be going through a number of these questions, or at least explaining the story of how it is that we got here as we break down this war that really no one appears to actually be talking about, and why this is something that is going to matter way beyond just Africa itself. But again, as you all know how we do things here on the History of Everything, in order to explain this conflict as well as the crisis, we need to go back a bit. We need to get some context first. Now, to start, when it is that I'm talking about these things, I need to go ahead and say that I already did an episode several months back about Ibrahim Traore, the young new anti-Western dictator of Burkina Faso. He is one of the key characters in all of this, but this episode specifically is something that is focusing more on Mali, not Burkina Faso. So some of the information that you may hear today, here, which sounds weird the way I'm phrasing it, but some of the stuff that you're probably going to hear today could overlap. I just wanted to give you all a bit of a heads up now, and I recommend that you go check out that video as well, which looked at things in a more, we're going to say, wishful thinking kind of way. That wishful thinking had not exactly panned out. Anyway, in order to understand the Mali conflict, one must first understand the deep historical and ethnic divisions that have shaped the region for centuries. Because, of course, when we're talking about Africa, that is always something that inevitably ends up happening. Mali, for those of you that are a little bit unaware of geography, sits at the intersection of two profoundly different kinds of worlds. You have the Sahara Desert to the north, historically inhabited by nomadic Berber and Arab people, and you have the Sahel and Sudanic savannas to the south, which is home to the more sedentary black African agricultural societies, including the Bambara, the Sonike, the Songhai, the Malinke, etc. Now, we don't need to necessarily go into all of that, and I'm not going to go back into too much detail. I know the reputation that I have here in the first place, but it is kind of important to establish at least a little bit of background in the general far history of the country. The medieval Mali Empire, which existed from the 13th to the 16th century, and the Songhai Empire that followed, would bring these regions into political contact with one another, but largely this was never a united entity. It never was. The cultural, the linguistic, the economic divisions, all of these things that had existed for centuries, they remained very pronounced. One of these differences, the Tuareg, which is a group that we're going to need to focus on, that is a Berber people who developed a very distinct identity over the course of these centuries of trans Saharan trade as well as nomadic pastoralism. They would go and establish their own confederations across what is now Mali, Niger, Algeria, Libya, and Burkina Faso. Their society was something that was traditionally very hierarchical, with a noble warrior caste that would rule over vassal groups, as well as a class of black slaves and former slaves known as Bella. This was a social structure that would later complicate post colonial racial politics, which, oh, yeah, that's literally the story of everything in Africa itself. Like, remember what I'm talking about here, people. The reason I am going back that far, and I talked about the differences or the divisions between the Malian people and this particular ethnic group here, is because these people that I just talked about, the Tuareg, I mentioned them in the intro, if you caught that, with the FLA and the Tuareg dominated Azawad Liberation Front. They become a part of the story because when French colonialism would arrive in the late 19th century, well, colonizers, I guess we're going to say here, would go and draw very arbitrary borders that split the Tuareg homeland across multiple territories without, any kind of care for ethnic continuity, if you will. French Sudan, which became Mali at its point of independence in 1960, was something that was administered primarily through southern black populations, who, in the aftermath of this independence, would receive the lion's share of colonial education and bureaucratic positions. This, as you could probably imagine, is something that would create a fundamental imbalance that would persist long after independence. You had a state whose political power was largely concentrated in Bamako in the south, with the black African population governing a vast northern territory whose inhabitants felt very culturally as well as politically alienated. And that is always, a recipe for total peace and stability, as I'm sure you all are aware. The first president, Modibo Keita, would go and pursue a socialist centralized state that the Tuareg perceived as actively hostile to their nomadic way of life, which is something that would lead directly to the First Tuareg Rebellion of 1962 to 1964, and that is something that was brutally suppressed by the Malian army. That, unfortunately, is a pattern that would continue on for many decades, a pattern of marginalization, periodic rebellion, and then harsh repression that would go again and again and again and again, with major uprisings taking place from 1990 to 1995 and 2007 to 2009, each ending in peace agreements that were inadequately implemented and which left the underlying grievances festering over time. Over the course of all the decades that I've been talking about here, the Tuareg would consistently seek autonomy, or independence, depending upon the time and place, for what they called Azawad, a territory that would comprise the regions of Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal. They did not want to be part of this Malian entity, or if they did, it was in a very limited capacity. Now, mind you, when I'm talking about this, I could go into very heavy detail about all these different conflicts and uprisings and everything else, because yes, they are a part of the story. But it also means this video would go on for several more hours, and at the time that I was trying to make this, I was preparing to go to Greece. Now I just finished with my trip in Greece, and I am getting ready to have my trip to Croatia that is launching in like a day, and I don't have time to focus on all this here now. I have to hurry. Oh yeah, side note there, but if you want to join me in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania this year, or I mean, I was going to say China, but those actually all sold out. But if you want to join me in the Baltic for the Christmas markets here at the end of 2026, check out my links down in the description. Yeah, okay. Anyway, back to Mali and the Tuareg. In order to properly explain this, we need to skip ahead to the early 2010s. And despite me skipping ahead to that time, funnily enough, the actual trigger for the 2012 war, which is the event that technically speaking is ongoing to this very day that we're citing here in the first place, that didn't start in Mali. The trigger for that war started outside of it in Libya. To explain that, for anyone who went and saw the episode that I did on Muammar Gaddafi and how much of a madman that guy was, and yes, I'm planning on doing future episodes on different things for dictators and the countries and how they are nowadays, long after they've passed, but Muammar Gaddafi of Libya had long cultivated Tuareg fighters. Now you may wonder, why would he do this? Why would he support all these varying different people of a country that was not his own? Well, that's because he could make them loyal to him. He would recruit thousands of Tuareg fighters into his military forces and his Islamic Legion. something that would allow them to be paid very well and provide them with sophisticated weaponry. See, he saw the Tuareg as a kind of pan Saharan force that would allow him to project Libyan influence across the region. When the Libyan civil war would erupt in 2011 and Gaddafi was eventually killed in October of that year, though, everything kind of went to absolute crap. The Tuareg fighters who had served under him suddenly found themselves unemployed. Unemployed, yes, but extremely well armed, which again, historically, is not exactly a recipe for stability. They would go and return to their home countries in waves, bringing with them weapons that had been looted from Libyan arsenals, including not just like standard assault rifles or things like that. We're talking machine guns, rocket launchers, anti aircraft systems, vehicles, anything you could think of that was part of a modern military because Gaddafi invested very heavily in this stuff. Suddenly, these ethnic militiamen had access to. The Malian government at the time, which was extremely weak and corrupt under President Amadou Toumani Touré, also known as ATT, who that is probably how I'm going to be citing him from now on here. They failed to anticipate or manage this influx of new fighters, and many of these veterans then began to organize politically. In fact, it was in October of 2011 that the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, the MNLA, was founded. That is something that would merge several Tuareg political movements with the returning fighters. And the MNLA, I need to specify here from the very beginning here, was explicitly a secular and nationalist entity. This was not a Islamist force. They would frame their struggle as one for self-determination for the Tuareg people, rather than a kind of religious revolution to establish a pan-African Islamic state. Nothing like that. But there was a force like that, because simultaneously a more dangerous entity was coalescing. You have an individual by the name of Iyad Ag Ghali, a veteran Tuareg leader who had once led the 1990s rebellion and once served as a Malian diplomat in Saudi Arabia, who over the course of this time would undergo a rapid religious transformation towards Salafist Islam. Now, after being denied leadership of the MNLA, he would found Ansar Dine, the Defenders of the Faith, this being an Islamist group that would seek to impose Sharia law across Mali rather than just achieve Tuareg independence. Now, crucially, Ansar Dine had connections to Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the AQIM, a group that would evolve from the Algerian Islamist insurgency of the 1990s and had established sanctuary in northern Mali's vast ungoverned spaces over the course of the previous decade. The way that they were able to seize power here, or to accrue power for themselves, I should say, is that they would be able to finance themselves through kidnappings. They would kidnap people for ransom and trans-Saharan smuggling. Beyond them, though, there was a third group, the Movement for Oneness and Jihad in West Africa, or MUJAO. They would actually break off from AQIM, and they were distinguished by including more Black African and Arab fighters and operating primarily around Gao. There were a multitude of these different groups, and as you could probably guess, everything that I have been describing here is a perfect setup for everything to go to absolute crap. And it was not going to take long for exactly that to happen. The rebellion that would kick off everything for this video in the first place would first launch in January of 2012, with simultaneous attacks on Malian army garrisons across the north. The Malian military, which was chronically underfunded, poorly equipped, and heavily demoralized by decades of just terrible neglect and management, would prove utterly incapable of mounting effective resistance. Garrison after garrison would fall, oftentimes after sieges in which surrounded soldiers would run out of ammunition while the government in Bamako would send nothing to actually try to help them. In fact, when I'm going and describing this, the most notorious incident was something that was called the Massacre at Agulok in January of 2012. This being when dozens of captured Malian soldiers were executed, some reportedly having their throats slit in jihadist fashion. News of this atrocity, combined with the apparent indifference of the political class to actually do anything to alleviate the suffering of their frontline soldiers, would thus ignite fury within the army. And look, my friends, I don't think that I need to tell you here that not paying your army while also getting your butt kicked is an instant recipe for instability throughout pretty much all of history and mutinies. This would be no different. On March 21st, 2012, mid-ranking officers led by Captain Amadou Haya Sonogo, an American-trained junior officer with no actual significant command experience, would launch a mutiny at the Kati military base near Bamako, and that is something that quickly would snowball into a full-blown coup. President ATT would flee, and Senegal would go and declare himself as the head of state, justifying the seizure of power as claiming that, oh, well, the civilian government had betrayed the army and failed to provide adequate resources to fight the rebellion. And so they needed to take power to fix things themselves. But this did not go how pretty much anyone thought it would inside the coup. The irony was extremely savage, if you will. The coup, ostensibly something that was launched to better prosecute the war, instead produced complete catastrophe. Because with the chain of command in chaos, political institutions paralyzed, and international donors immediately suspending all aid and imposing sanctions because, go figure, it was no longer a democratically elected government, it was a military coup, what remained of the Malian military's coherence? Completely dissolved and fell apart. In the weeks following the coup, northern Mali would collapse entirely. Kidal would fall on March 30th, Gao on March 31st, Timbuktu on April 1st, and from this, the MNLA would declare the independent state of Azawad on April 6th, 2012, though, even though they did this, no country would actually recognize them. Now, when I'm going describing all this, and again, we are only in 2012, you would think at this point that that should spell the end of Mali itself, right? After all, separatist and jihadist forces were on the roll, state was physically incapable of mounting any kind of defense, let alone a response in the first place. But no, actually, as it turns out, that is not the way that things would go down. Weirdly enough, the alliance between the MNLA and the Islamists, which was something that was always a bit uneasy considering one was secular and one being a jihadist entity, that alliance quickly fractured. The Islamist factions had way more money thanks to AQIM's ransom wealth. They had more discipline. They were less interested in compromise with the state. They didn't want simple autonomy, they wanted to take everything over. And so by June of 2012, fighting would break out between the MNLA and Ansar Dine and Mujao, especially at the Battle of Gao on June 27th. This being when Islamists would rout the secular Tuareg fighters and would seize the city of Gao outright. Within weeks, the entire north was unified under Islamist control, with Ansar Dine dominant in the Kidal region, AQIM operating broadly, and Mujao going and controlling Gao. From here, the Islamists were able to immediately set about implementing their own vision of having an Islamic state, imposing strict Sharia law, requiring women to be fully veiled, banning music, which, for anyone who's curious about that, that's a big blow to Mali, who has a huge musical heritage in the first place, and that is something that is a great punishment for them, conducting public amputations of accused thieves, executing alleged adulterers by stoning, and destroying ancient Sufi shrines as well as mausoleums in Timbuktu that they considered idolatrous. It was a brutal affair, and the destruction of Timbuktu's heritage, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site of irreplaceable manuscripts and architecture dating back all the way to the medieval Mali period, that was something that was horrifying and provoked international outrage and was later even prosecuted as a war crime at the International Criminal Court, which would result in the conviction of Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi in 2016. But we aren't quite there yet. That was long after the fact. Right now, unfortunately, everything in 2012 and 2013 was going to be utter confusion. Throughout late 2012, the international community would debate some kind of intervention. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, would go and propose an African-led force, and the UN Security Council would eventually authorize one. Meanwhile, a transitional civilian government under President or interim President Daikunda Traore would go and attempt to restore some semblance of order in Bamako, though Senegal and his junta would continue to exert influence behind the scenes, and that is something that has been a major problem when it's come to the military in Mali in history. But the decisive moment is something that would come about in January of 2013. This being when Islamist forces, sensing weakness, would go and abandon their defensive posture in the north and began to instead advance south. The town of Kona would fall on January 10th, putting jihadists within striking distance of the strategically vital airport at Sevare, and beyond it, the road to Bamako itself. Faced with the prospect then of a complete Islamist takeover of a West African nation, this was not something that Western powers could allow, especially the former colonial holder of this land, France. French President Francois Hollande would then immediately order military intervention. And that is something that I need to go ahead and specify here right now. That is something that is arguably necessary, yes, but also at the same time, considering French colonial history and its relations with post colonial African nations, that is also something that is definitely quite controversial. Criticism would be more muted in the beginning, though, because of just how incredibly effective the French actually were at this time at fighting. Again, I know there's a lot of jokes when it comes to things about the French and their military on the internet and surrender. That does not apply in any sense of the word to the modern French military. It is, in fact, a very disciplined fighting machine. And they demonstrate that here. Operation Serval, launched in January 11th, 2013, was a remarkable display of expeditionary military power. French Mirage and Rafale fighters would go and fly from bases in Chad or even directly from France itself and manage to strike jihadist columns and bases, while special forces and rapidly deployed conventional troops would eventually number around 4,000 and push northward alongside Malian forces and Chadian troops, which these proved to be especially effective in desert fighting, going right into the heart of the insurgency. Within weeks, the major northern cities had pretty much all been liberated. Gao on January 26th, Timbuktu on January 28th, and Kidal on January 30th. The jihadists, recognizing that they could not match French firepower in conventional combat in the field, instead decided to disperse into the Adrar des Ificus Mountains near the Algerian border and also into the broader Sahara, where intense fighting would continue on through February and March of 2013. Over the course of this time, several senior AQIM commanders were killed in these operations, including the notorious Abu Zaid. However, at the same time that I say that, the speed of the French victory, which, yes, was absolutely impressive and awesome, that also masked a fundamental problem. The jihadists were not destroyed. They never were destroyed. They were merely dispersed. And the underlying political grievances that had enabled the rebellion in the first place, those remained entirely unresolved. That, my friends, is where we get into the longer term and more controversial aspect of all of this. In July of 2013, the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, or MINUSMA, MINUSMA, that is something that was deployed, eventually growing to over 15,000 personnel from dozens of contributing countries. Now, to explain what exactly this is a force that had a mandate that included supporting political stabilization, protecting civilians, and facilitating humanitarian assistance. MINUSMA would be something that would become one of the deadliest UN peacekeeping missions, though, in the organization's history, with over 300 personnel being killed in it, the vast majority of which had come from Chad and also the other West African contingents that bore the blunt of most jihadist attacks in the most dangerous areas. This mission was repeatedly criticized as time went on for being way too restricted in its mandate, too defensively postured to actually counter the jihadist threat. They may hold the cities, but they couldn't go out and take out the jihadists themselves to stop the attacks from occurring in the first place. At the same time, because they wouldn't go out and the Islamists were able to continue to attack them again and again, that is something that would demonstrate to the public that the jihadists had power. This is something they could use specifically for recruitment efforts, and they would do exactly that. Because of the troubles that were faced, in August of 2014, France would eventually transition from Operation Serval to Operation Barkhane, a broader counterterrorism mission that would span the entirety of the Sahel and was headquartered in N'Djamena, Chad. But despite that, when I say that it covered all of the Sahel, I mean it pretty much covered the entirety of the Sahel. Barkhane would operate across 5 different countries: Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Mauritania, altogether which would form the G5 Sahel, an institutional framework promoted by France for regional security cooperation. From here, Barkhane would eventually deploy around 5,500 French troops and would conduct ongoing operations against jihadist cells, managing to kill or capture numerous high-value targets, which includes AQIM Emir Abdelmalek Drukdel in June of 2020, as well as ISGS leader Adnan Abu Walid al-Sarwawi in August of 2021, which I probably just butchered the pronunciation of that. But anyway, they had some success. But despite these tactical successes, the strategic picture continued to deteriorate as time went on because the jihadists would adapt. They would decentralize. They would spread their operations across borders. They would exploit the porous frontiers and the overlapping ethnic framework of the Sahel region itself. It was, if anything, a gigantic, brutal game of whack a mole. Whack down one, two more pops up in its place. It was a Hydra whack a mole situation. But even when I'm going and describing that, I don't want you to think that it was all negative because no, it would absolutely not. On top of that, great gains were actually made in some other areas. Like, as an example, a crucial development would come with June of 2015 and the Algiers Peace Accord. This was a peace agreement between the Malian government and a coalition of northern armed groups, including the MNLA and other Tuareg Arab factions, and were organized as the Coordination of Azawad Movements, or CMA. But despite being composed of a variety of different entities, they would explicitly exclude jihadist groups, which is a really big deal. The accord would promise greater regional autonomy, integration of former rebels into security forces, and development investment in the north. All of this was really big and necessary. And on paper, when it is that I'm going describing it, this was huge, huge. In fact, it would mean security forces that were spread thinner to try and go and combat two different types of fighters could instead focus on just the jihadists. On top of that, their security forces could theoretically be supplemented, adding even more manpower and coverage than they ever had before. But remember what I just said on paper. Implementation, however, was completely disastrous. The Malian government would drag its feet on devolving power, the integration of fighters would proceed slowly and incompletely, and promised development funds materialized rarely, very inconsistently. And because of that and other things, mutual suspicion would poison relations between Bamako, the capital, and the northern groups. Still, despite all of this, the accord would nevertheless hold formally for years and would prevent the resumption of large-scale Tuareg government fighting, allowing the French, as well as international forces, to focus on the jihadist threat. Now, this is something that would be especially important because that threat was about to get a lot worse. The reason I say that here, my friends, is because while the focus of intervention forces remained on northern Mali, the most consequential development of the mid 2010s ended up being the spread of jihadism into central Mali itself, particularly the Mopti and Segol regions. Why am I bringing this up? You may wonder. You'll see. You'll see. This is a very important thing. This expansion is something that was driven primarily by Amadou Kofa, who was a Fulani preacher. Fulani being one of the tribes here. He was a guy who founded the Masina Liberation Front, named after the historical Fulani Masina Empire from the 19th century. Now, Kofa would go and skillfully exploit the grievances within the Fulani community, which was a very traditional, more pastoralist people that were scattered across the Sahel and had long-standing conflicts with neighboring agricultural communities, especially the Dogon and the Bambara, over land and water resources. As climate change would go and intensify pressure on these resources, these conflicts would thus escalate, and Kofa would offer the Fulani men weapons, protection, as well as a religious political framework for their grievances, which is not a recipe for anything positive to happen, we will say. In March of 2017, the various jihadist factions would consolidate. Iyad Ghali's Ansar Dine, Kufa's Messina Liberation Front, and the Saharan branch of the AQIM and Al Maburatun, which was a group led by a one-eyed Algerian jihadist by the name of Mukhtar Belmokhtar. They would go and merge to form Jamaat al-Nasr al-Islam wal-Muslimin, aka JNIM, the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims. Now, JNIM would immediately swear allegiance to al-Qaeda and become the dominant jihadist force within the entirety of the Sahel. But then guess what? They were not the only one, because separately, dissidents who preferred allegiance to the Islamic State would form the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, the ISGS. This being something that was led by Adnan Abu Walid al-Sarawi, the guy who I spoke about here before. Now, if everything that I've been describing here sounds a bit confusing, because yes, I know I'm throwing around a lot of names and acronyms and everything else like that, I really can't blame you for being confused. This was something that was very complicated, and the relationship between JNIM and ISGS was always shifting, so it's kind of hard to get a firm read on them, because sometimes they were cooperating against common enemies. And sometimes they were engaging in vicious fratricidal warfare against each other, especially from 2020 onward. The whole thing was kind of a mess. But anyway, the spread of jihadism into central Mali is something that would create horrific intercommunal violence. You had ethnic militias that were formed, most notoriously the Dana Ambasago Dogon Self Defense Group, which is something that would conduct massacres against Fulani villages accused of harboring jihadists. The Osego massacre of March of 2019, in which Dogon militants would kill over 150 Fulani villagers, that was also among the worst single atrocities. But, and I know this is something that would come up in the comments if I do not actually go and mention it, I need to go ahead and specify here right now that the Malian army was also implicated in numerous abuses as well, oftentimes conducting indiscriminate operations against Fulani communities, which in turn is something that to this day, with their other actions, have had a tendency to drive people right into the hands of the jihadists to fight back against the government. This cycle of communal violence, jihadist recruitment, and then state repression would feed on itself, with violence spilling across the border into Burkina Faso, where the situation became even worse than what you had in Mali, and also Niger. Really, at this point, nothing in the Sahel seemed to be going great. But once again, just wait, it gets worse. By 2020, public frustration in Mali had reached a boiling point. President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, also known as IBK, who had been elected in 2013 with international backing, presided for the next 7 years over a regime of rampant corruption, a stagnating economy, and an ever worsening security situation. A controversial constitutional court ruling overturning parliamentary election results in March of 2020 would then spark the M5 RFP protest movement, something that was led by the influential Imam Mahmoud Dicko and a coalition of opposition politicians and civil society activists, none of which were happy with the government. Massive protests in Bamako would go throughout the summer of 2020, demanding IBK's resignation. And on August 18th, 2020, the military decided to not wait any further. Military officers led by Colonel Assimi Goita, head of the Special Forces, would arrest IBK and force his resignation. From here, they would take over the country themselves. This junta, calling itself the National Committee for the Salvation of the People, would initially accept a transitional arrangement led by former Defense Minister Ba Nda as president, with Goita acting as vice president, in deference to ECOWAS pressure for civilian leadership. On paper, again, on paper, it seemed things could actually stabilize and get better. But no, this arrangement lasted for less than a year. In May of 2021, when Nda would go and conduct a cabinet reshuffle without consulting Goita, that colonel was in turn so pissed off that he staged a second coup, arresting Nda and Prime Minister Mokhtar Ouane and assuming the presidency for, go figure, himself. This second coup would definitively shatter Mali's relationship with ECOWAS, the African Union, the European Union, as well as France. Goita's junta, facing international sanctions and increasing hostile diplomatic relations with the West, would thus make a very fateful strategic pivot towards Russia, because he needed allies. He needed something. Because sure, that is a smart move and would definitely not have grave complications for the, next year or so, because Russia would absolutely never launch a short 3-day military operation that would somehow manage to last over 4 years. Totally not. Anyway, we're not quite there yet. By late 2021, evidence would emerge of the Wagner Group's deployment to Mali, with reports of around 1,000 Russian mercenaries arriving by early 2022. The junta would also go and expel French ambassadors, restricting French media operations, denouncing bilateral defense agreements with Paris, and embracing an aggressively anti-Western rhetorical posture that would resonate significantly, I will admit, with portions of the Malian public, which their whole point of opinion was being very frustrated with perceived failures of French interventionism because it had done something in the beginning, but it hadn't fixed the issue. And so the Malian people, exhausted, wanted something different. And so, my friends, that is the way the cookie would pretty much crumble. The deterioration of Franco-Malian relations was rapid and just unpleasant. France refusing to legitimize the junta and unwilling to operate alongside Wagner mercenaries that it regarded as Russian proxies and as human rights violators, would announce the withdrawal of Operation Barkhane from Mali in February 2022. The last French troops would leave in August of 22, eroding nearly a decade of French military presence. The European Union training mission would also wind down, with other Western partners reducing their own engagement. The junta would then turn on MINUSMA, repeatedly restricting its operations and ultimately demanding its own withdrawal in June of 2023. The UN mission completed its departure by December of 2023, and with that, it would leave Mali without international peacekeepers for the first time in over a decade. From here, then, with basically no real oversight of any kind, Wagner mercenaries would quickly become implicated in serious atrocities. Most notoriously, the Mura massacre of March of 2022, in which Wagner fighters alongside Malian soldiers killed at least 500 civilians, according to UN investigations, in a multi day operation that the government characterized as simply a counterterrorism success. Really, my friends, to go into more detail about this, the Mura massacre stands as perhaps the single most documented and infamous atrocity of the Wagner era in Mali, and it's probably one of the worst civilian massacres that has occurred in West Africa in literally decades. For context of this, because I'm going to have to explain at least a little bit, Mora is a small town in central Mali's Mopti region, predominantly inhabited by Fulani populations and located in an area where Janim had significant influence. The way that all this went down is that between March 27th and March 31st of 2022, Malian special forces and approximately 100 Wagner mercenaries would conduct a multi-day operation that began with helicopter-borne troops surrounding the town on the day of a weekly market, and this is when the population was swollen with visitors from surrounding villages. According to a comprehensive UN human rights investigation released in May of 2023, at least 500 people were killed during the operation, and the vast majority of them were unarmed civilians. Survivors and witnesses would describe soldiers and white foreign fighters, clearly identified as Russian by the way that they were speaking and their appearance, that they would go and separate the men from the women and children, conduct summary executions in groups, and then dump the bodies in mass graves. Many victims were elderly people, religious leaders, or traders who had no connection to the jihadist groups. They were just there at that time, working. Witnesses would report systematic looting of livestock, money, and gold from the population. Women were assaulted during it, and torture was conducted to extract information about the supposed jihadist hideouts that existed in the area. From here, the UN investigation would find credible evidence that the killings were not the result of combat, but were deliberate extrajudicial executions of people who had been detained and were under the control of the joint Malian Wagner force. It was pretty damningly obvious that something had gone really wrong, but that's not what the Malian government said. The Malian government's response to the massacre was kind of indicative of the whole broader pattern that we would see from them. The junta would initially claim a major military victory, asserting that they had taken out 203 terrorists, that they had been neutralized, and that in fact there was no civilian casualties. It was all denied. But then, when evidence of the massacre actually emerged, the government would deny access to investigators, harass journalists that were attempting to cover the story, and accused international human rights organizations of being part of a Western conspiracy to undermine the Malian state. Because yes, of course. No investigation was ever seriously conducted by the Malian authorities, and the official position remains to this day that the operation was a successful counterterrorism action. Now, do you think that things are going to get better from there? No, of course not. Why would you possibly think that? The UN's release of its own damning report in 2023 was met with the junta going and demanding for the withdrawal of MINUSMA, as well as accelerating the end of its peacekeeping mission. Now, critically, the Mura operation would actually appear to have served jihadist recruitment, as surviving Fulani community members and their relatives across the region would cite it as definitive proof that the Malian state and its Russian allies represented an existential threat to their community, with Janim providing the only available protection. Besides that, they have literally nothing. Oh, and when I go and say this, mind you, everything that I'm describing here, this was only one of many similar massacres and crimes to occur. Oh, and also, I don't want to detract from the video too much, but understanding why Wagner's involvement produced such severe atrocities is kind of important. And to talk about that, it requires examining the group's structure and its incentives and the way that the whole thing operates. See, Wagner in Mali operated under no Malian legal framework. The mercenaries were not formally integrated into Malian forces, they were not subject to Malian military law, and their presence was officially denied, oftentimes by the junta, even as it was obvious to all the observers that those white guys aren't Malian over there. The group ended up getting paid both directly by the junta, with estimates of $10 million per month at various different points, and also through concessions in Mali's gold mining sector, particularly through the Yatela and other gold mining operations. This is something that would create a kind of perverse incentive. Wagner fighters would profit from the conflict's continuation and had financial interest then in controlling territory where mining operations were located and keeping the fighting going longer. Combine this with the group's selection of fighters coming from the Russian prison population, especially during the Prigozhin era of 2022 to 2023, and its institutional culture of impunity, this would produce a force that was optimized for violence with basically no consideration for political consequences. Mind you, this operational doctrine is something that differed fundamentally from what French forces had practiced. Where French Barkhane operations had emphasized precision strikes against identified jihadist leaders and avoided large ground sweeps of civilian populations, with, yes, there were, of course, significant exceptions, including the Punti strike of January 2021 that did kill civilians at a wedding. That did happen. It wasn't deliberate, like in the case of what was happening with Wagner. Wagner operatives would involve deploying mercenaries embedded with Malian units in sweeping ground operations through villages that were suspected of harboring jihadists. And the result was inevitable. Villages in areas of jihadist influence were treated as, well, being supporters. They were within enemy territory after all, and their inhabitants were enemy combatants regardless of their actual roles. It was a terrible situation, but even when I'm going and describing that, it would be misleading to attribute all the atrocities to Wagner influence, as I kind of mentioned here earlier, the Malian armed forces have an extensive history of abuses dating back way before the Russian arrival. In 2018 and 2019, before there was any Wagner presence really, the FAMA would conduct operations in central Mali that human rights organizations would document as involving extensive extrajudicial executions of Fulani civilians. The Nantaka and Kobaka mass graves that were discovered in 2018 would contain the bodies of 25 men summarily executed by Malian soldiers. And then, throughout 2019 and 2020, there would be documented incidents of the Malian military going and killing detained suspects, burning villages, and destroying livelihoods of Fulani pastoralists that would accumulate steadily over the course of this. All of which would contribute to the radicalization of the population that would fuel Janim's expansion in central Mali itself. At the same time that all of that would happen, the Malian government has also been implicated in supporting and arming ethnic militias that commit atrocities, especially the Dogon self defense groups in central Mali that I mentioned here before. The Dan Na Ambasago militia, while not exactly a formal state force, was widely understood to receive weapons and protection from elements of the Malian security apparatus. Its forces would commit the Osago massacre in March of 2019, killing approximately 160 Fulani villagers, including pregnant women and children, in what survivors would describe as a coordinated dawn attack on an undefended village. A second Osago massacre would occur in February of 2020, and this would kill approximately 35 more villagers. While the Malian government would formally ban Dan Naambasago after the first massacre, that is a ban that was never really fully enforced, and the militia would continue to operate with apparent state tolerance. This pattern, then, of state collusion with ethnic militias would represent a deliberate strategy of outsourcing counterinsurgency violence to actors who would be able to attack communities that the state regarded as enemies without really having any kind of formal accountability. It became a useful bludgeoning tool, if you will. And that's not the only thing. Beyond mass killings, the Malian state under the junta has been implicated in extensive use of arbitrary detention, torture, and forced disappearance. Detention facilities, particularly those used for counterterrorism purposes, have been documented to involve systematic torture, including beatings, electric shocks, simulated drowning, and prolonged stress positions. Detainees, often held without charge for extended periods, included not just suspected jihadists, but also northern community leaders, journalists, opposition political figures, civil society activists. It goes way deeper than just simple Islamists. The Camp 1 detention facility in Bamako and various secret detention sites across the country would then be the focus of human rights documentation, with multiple deaths in custody being recorded and the bodies sometimes being returned to families, showing clear signs of torture. And this pattern of disappearances is something that has been particularly devastating to affected communities. Men detained during sweeping military sweeps, I guess you would say here, they're often simply just vanishing into thin air, with families being unable to obtain any kind of information about their whereabouts. What are the charges against them? Confirmation on whether or not they're alive. No one knows anything. And this produced compound traumas, as families could neither mourn deaths or advocate for the release of their sons and cousins and brothers. International documentation efforts would compile lists of hundreds of disappeared individuals, though the actual numbers could certainly be a lot higher. Now, looking at everything that I have been describing here, you all may be wondering, why am I going on about all this? Well, you will understand in just a second, because now we have to go back slightly to just right after the French left. The departure of French and UN forces would fundamentally alter the strategic landscape. The northern armed groups that had signed the 2015 Algiers Accord had relied implicitly on the international presence of French forces to balance the Malian state, along with other international forces. With that presence gone, though, and the junta in Bamako increasingly nationalist and confrontational and siding with Russia, the accord effectively would collapse in 2023. The trigger, though, was the junta's decision, backed by Wagner support, to retake territory in the north, particularly around Kidal, which had been controlled by the CMA Tuareg coalition for most of the previous decade. In a major offensive in late 2023, Malian forces and Wagner mercenaries would capture Kidal in November of that year, a major symbolic victory for the junta, but also one that would reopen full scale war with the Tuareg that they definitely were not prepared for. The Tuareg armed groups would reorganize as the Permanent Strategic Framework for the Defense of the People of Azawad, the CSP-DPA, and resume armed struggle. In a striking development, the previously bitter enemies, the secular Tuareg nationalists and the Janim jihadists, actually then began tactical cooperation against their common enemy of Wagner and the Malian army, and this convergence would produce the most dramatic single military event in the entirety of the war, the Battle of Tinzoaten in late July of 2024. A column of Malian soldiers and Wagner mercenaries were advancing in the far north near the Algerian border, and they were ambushed by a combined Tuareg and Janim force in a sandstorm, the result of which was catastrophic for the government side. Dozens of Wagner fighters were killed, estimates ranging from 50 to over 80, including senior commanders, along with significant Malian army casualties. It was Wagner's worst single defeat anywhere in Africa and demonstrated that the post French military configuration was nowhere near capable of pacifying the North, and their alliance with Burkina Faso and Niger was not exactly amounting to much. Which, yeah, I haven't really talked about them over the course of this episode, and I'm not going to go into crazy detail, but to explain that, coups in Burkina Faso, which had been in January and September of 2022, and Niger in July of 2023, would bring to power military juntas with similar anti Western, pro Russian orientations. In September of 2023, the three countries had formed the Alliance of the Sahel States, the AES, initially as a mutual defense pact. But then in January of 2024, the three nations announced their withdrawal from ECOWAS, which had been pressuring them to return to civilian rule. And over the course of 2024 to 2025, they then deepened their ties into a confederation with plans for a common citizenship, a common parliament, and eventually, even possibly, a common currency to replace the CFA franc that was tied to France. Which, oh lord, if that actually happened, that would represent a massive, dramatic geopolitical reorientation of the Central Sahel away from the post colonial Francophone framework and towards a more new nationalist, multipolar orientation that would include expanded ties with Russia, where Wagner was, of course, then reorganized as the Africa Corps under the more direct Russian state control following Prigozhin's death, mysteriously, in August of 2023, along with Turkey, Iran, and to some extent, China. Yeah, anyway, I probably need to do a full episode dedicated to just Wagner itself, but we need to wrap this up. And to do that, we're going to go back to Mali in 2024, through then 2025 and 2026. So, my friends, The final months of 2024 would unfold under the long shadow of the Tinzoatin disaster. Russian mill bloggers and their families of dead mercenaries had publicized casualties that the Russian state had attempted to obscure, and this would produce a very unusual moment of transparency about Russia's military involvement in Africa because normally they denied things. The Wagner or Africa Corps presence in Mali in the immediate aftermath was visibly shaken, with reports through August and September 2024 of reduced patrol activity, consolidation in defensive positions around major garrison towns, and reluctance to conduct the kind of sweeping ground operations that had previously characterized the Russian Malian joint actions before in the north. In August and September of 2024, then, the CSP DPA would go and exploit this strategic shock with intensified operations across the north. Ambushes on military convoys around Kidal, Tessalit, and Agulak would all go and inflict continuing casualties. Several smaller military positions were overrun by rebel attacks, with garrisons either being destroyed outright or forced to withdraw. The junta's response then was doubling down on drone warfare, with Turkish Bayraktar TB2 strikes intensifying across northern Mali in operations that the government characterized as successful counterterrorism actions, but which increasingly produced documented civilian casualties and didn't really amount to much. As just an example of this, a series of drone strikes through August and September of 2024 would hit Tuareg pastoral camps, with most significant incidents producing dozens of civilian deaths from communities with no clear connection to the armed groups whatsoever. They were just existing. But that would not be enough. And heading into 2025, a new, far more effective long term strategy would finally be launched by anti government forces. January of 2025 would open with major JNIM operations targeting the road networks connecting Bamako to the rest of the country. The Bamako Cays Road, vital for its trade with Senegal and the country's main supply route, given the closure of its frontier to the east, came under increasing attack. Several convoys were ambushed, fuel shortages would then begin to affect Bamako itself, and the government found itself unable to guarantee security along with its most essential infrastructure. These developments would produce a very perceptible shift in the political atmosphere of Bamako, with grumbling about the junta's performance becoming even more audible within the previously supportive constituencies, though formal opposition remained constrained by severe repression. Then, fast forward in February of 2025, the CSP DPA held what it described as a strategic Congress, reportedly at a location in the desert under its control. The Congress would formally adopt independence as the political goal of the coalition, repudiating the autonomy framework of the 2015 Algiers Accord that the junta had unilaterally just destroyed. The Congress would establish structures resembling a government in formation, with developments for political affairs, military affairs, and external relations and humanitarian coordination all being a thing. As for who was actually going to be in charge, this was going to be Bilal Ag Atarif, the longtime MNLA leader who would emerge as the central political figure of the coalition, while military leadership was distributed among varying different commanders from various constituent factions. Overall, the entire Congress was a reflection that the ideology from before with the Tuareg had changed, that there was going to be no future agreement with Bamako. That is not something that could be trusted. They were going to go for full independence. From here, fighting would intensify around the Kidal region as well as the Adrar des Ifogas area, the mountains, with Africa Corps forces cautiously resuming offensive operations in smaller configurations. March of that year would bring about significant CSP DPA diplomatic outreach to European capitals, with France in particular treating the coalition as a legitimate entity. May of 2025 would bring about the Malian gold mining sector into focus, as the junta would then announce major reorganizations of the industry, with significant concessions being transferred or given to Russian linked entities and various foreign mining companies that were facing then pressure to renegotiate terms or withdraw. Yeah, because I guess so much then for the Malian stance on no more foreign interference. Go figure. This will provide the government with money in the short term, sure, but long term, the economic effects were likely going to be terrible. We're not there yet, but this is likely going to be terrible. Fast forward then a little bit again, and in July of 2025, this would mark the Tinzoatin anniversary, with coordinated CSP DPA attacks across northern Mali. The junta would launch a major counteroffensive through July and August, and that produced limited territorial gains but significant casualties on both sides. Throughout the course of the summer, intercommunal violence in central Mali would intensify, with Fulani Dogon Bambara clashes producing additional massacres in Mopti and Bandiagara regions. And because of this, people fled. By mid 2025, displacement totals of the population in Mali would approach 750,000 people, which is a lot. These people were stuck and they had no real say about their government, something that was in turn about to be solidified. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in September of 2025, the junta would go and announce indefinite postponement of elections that had been variously promised across the years since the 2021 coup, with Goita consolidating personal power through his new constitutional arrangements. Opposition political figures would face intensified repression, with several prominent figures being arrested on charges ranging from undermining state security to corruption that were widely understood as being nothing more than political prosecutions. Press freedom would continue to deteriorate with time, with several journalists facing arrest, expulsion, or harassment, and major media outlets that had attempted to critically cover all of these different things were progressively being muzzled out or shut down. Everything was being cracked down on. And so by the end of the year, in 2025, in November and December of that year, this is where Janim would go and intensify operations near Bamako itself, as attacks on the capital's outskirts would take place. This would include incidents at military positions and security checkpoints that were within 50 kilometers of the city. This is something that demonstrated that the jihadist insurgency had reached a level of capability that the junta strategy of military suppression had failed to contain. The psychological impact then on Bamako's population was massive, with increased anxiety about the conflict's proximity affecting their daily life, petrol shortages, intermittent electricity, and rising prices would thus all create visible economic stress in the capital, eroding the junta's domestic political base, even as formal opposition still remained rather constrained. And really, it's not like they would be able to necessarily do much because more stuff was about to come out. Because at the same time these attacks were intensifying in December, this would also see the publication of multiple major human rights reports on the situation in Mali, including comprehensive documentation by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International of patterns of abuses by the Malian army and the African Corps across 2024 to 2025. The reports would document hundreds of incidents of summary executions, sexual violence, torture, and much more, especially affecting the Fulani communities in central Mali and the Tuareg communities in the north. The junta's response, though, was characteristic of what they had been doing the entire time, denouncing the reports as Western propaganda and restrictions on the remaining international NGOs so that they couldn't operate in Mali to do what they want anymore. From here, there would be accusations against Malian human rights defenders that would produce even new threats. This would effectively remain the pattern for the next several months. From here, then, my friends, as we're wrapping up things at the end, or starting to catch up, I should say, in April of 2026, this saw a series of very significant developments. The CSP DPA would conduct what it characterized as a major spring offensive across multiple fronts in northern Mali, with coordinated operations going and targeting Malian and African Corps positions over a period of approximately 3 weeks. And from that, they managed to seize Kidal once again in a major move, as well as inflicting significant casualties. Several smaller positions were also overrun and supply lines were being distributed, and so the junta's strategic position in the north was very visibly being stressed. As for what the response was going to be, yeah, that involved intensifying drone operations with reports of new Iranian supplied drones supplementing the Turkish Bayraktars that had been the mainstay of the unmanned fleet. These operations would produce additional civilian casualties, yes, with multiple incidents being documented in April and May of 2026 of, strikes hitting civilian gatherings, markets, religious ceremonies, and pastoral camps. All things the junta characterized as terrorist targets, but no, international criticism of these operations intensified, but had no real apparent effect on the junta's policy. Oh yeah, no, and by that way, on that note, we actually learned that part of the reason that this was so bad was because the Malian government was using cluster bombs. Yeah, that information literally just came out a few days ago. Yeah, that is a very recent development. From here, then, the economic situation in Mali throughout May of 2026 would continue to deteriorate. Inflation would affect basic commodities significantly, with food prices rising substantially over the year, and fuel shortages became a regular feature of urban life, including in Bamako. Electricity rationing would intensify during the hot season, with major power cuts affecting daily life and economic activity. The combination of these stress would go and produce visible public frustration, even as political space for expressing that kind of frustration remained muted. You couldn't criticize the government. You couldn't really do anything against the government. If you said anything, you would disappear. And so that, I guess, finally brings us to the month of June of 2026, the time that I am making this episode in the first place. And so, my friends, in the end here, as of mid June of 2026, the conflict is in a deeply entrenched crisis with no real visible pathway to resolution. The military balance has stabilized seemingly into a more recognizable pattern, with the junta and Africa Corps holding major urban centers as well as key road segments, while the CSP DPA controls vast rural and desert spaces in the north. JNIM operates across much of central Mali with increasing power and reach towards Bamako, and contested zones lie throughout the whole thing. Neither side can achieve decisive victory in the foreseeable future, as the junta lacks the military capability to defeat the rebel jihadist combination across the territory, even with continued Russian support, while the rebels cannot expel the junta from major garrison towns, even with their enhanced capabilities, because they simply don't have the time, resources, men, material, etc. It's something that is going to just drag out. The humanitarian situation, then, along with that, is just catastrophic. Displacement exceeds 800,000 people internally and across borders. Food insecurity affects approximately 7 million Malians, and the collapse of basic services across wide areas has produced what humanitarian organizations describe as one of Africa's worst ever crises. Educational systems serve only a fraction of school aged children in affected areas. Healthcare provisions have basically collapsed across much of the north and the center, and the long term human capital damage will then affect Malian development for decades, regardless of who ends up coming out on top politically in the end. And to be honest, internally or externally, there's likely not much to be done for a political resolution. Politics within Mali have continued consolidating around Goita's personal rule. Elections remain indefinitely postponed. Opposition political activity is severely restricted. Press freedom largely eliminated. Civil society space tightly controlled. Everything is under the government. And so the junta's domestic political base, while eroded by economic deterioration naturally and the proximity of the insurgents' violence to the capital, that is still not something that has collapsed. Nationalist messaging, the framing of the conflict as being resistance against Western interference, and the absence of organized political alternatives have all managed to sustain sufficient support to at least allow the regime to exist as it is now. Externally, it is probably slightly better, but not necessarily by much. The diplomatic isolation of the junta has been firmly established by this point, as ECOWAS relations remain ruptured following the AES withdrawal in January of 2024. France and the EU treat the junta as a hostile authoritarian government, with the UN presence being gone following the 2023 MINUSMA withdrawal. Algeria has withdrawn from mediation. Russian support continues, but with constraints imposed by Moscow's Ukraine priorities and by the lessons of Tinzuotin regarding casualty exposure, there's not really all that much they can do. China maintains commercial relations, of course, but has avoided deep political realignment. Turkey continues drone sales without broader strategic commitment or any ideas. Iran, despite all of its own issues, provides limited military assistance throughout Russian intermediaries. The result is a junta that technically has friends. It has a number of sufficient external supports to sustain itself with, but it has insufficient support to be able to prevail in the war that it has chosen to prosecute. Looking forward across the remainder of 2026, the most likely trajectory for the whole thing is a continuous frozen conflict with hot edges. Like there will be episodic intensification of fighting, ongoing civilian suffering, expanding humanitarian crises, and progressive erosion of state authority in the north and center that will wear away at the country. That is practically guaranteed. The longer this continues, the more difficult any eventual settlement eventually becomes. The young generation of Northerners coming of age during this war have known nothing but conflict with the Malian state from the get go. And that is something that, not to mention witnessing atrocities by the state as well as their Russian allies. This is a generation that has been socialized to look more for independence instead of merely autonomy that earlier compromises had kept open. This generational shift may actually prove to be the most strategically consequential thing, the most crazy effect of the entire war, as even with a government victory, the whole thing can be repeated again just a decade or so later. Whatever territorial or political arrangement will eventually emerge in northern Mali will likely be substantially different from what unified Mali exists like now as its own framework, something that has existed since 1960, even if formal recognition of any changes remains far in the future. But with that, my friends, we are going to go ahead and end things here today. I have got to go to bed. I am absolutely exhausted. My wife is waiting on me here. Good night. I will see you all here next time. Let me know in the comment section below what it is you'd like to see next. I apologize for any kind of weird sound issue or for anything for the image. It is merely how things look because I am filming here while traveling and I'm trying to switch things up so that I'm using a different microphone so that hopefully this helps the sound issues. Anyway, goodbye, everyone.